Good evening, everybody. I'm Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of the YIVO Institute, and thank you all for coming on this raw and inhospitable evening. So I really appreciate it. This is going to be a wonderful concert. Some of you may know, many of you may not know, that the Crumb Young Artists Concert Series was established in 2009. The first performances were in 2010. And the intent of this series is to play work from our archive, to give Jewish music a chance to be heard in a way that it is not normally heard. And the performers are from the top music academies and young professional performers who are all at the highest caliber. So these are extraordinary performances which we will begin in the near future to edit into compilations for CDs and podcasts to make them more widely available. From the very outset of this series, Yuval Waldman, Maestro Waldman, has been the artistic director, and he not only curates the content of the programs, but he also coaches the musicians in their playing. Tonight, we are especially delighted to have Michael Levitt, president of the American Society for Jewish Music and founding director of the Museum of Yiddish Theater, with us. Paul Allen Levy, an acclaimed composer, is part of the program. The three-time Grammy-nominated clarinetist Todd Palmer, and violinist, conductor, and educator Yuval Waldman, as I said. I invite all of you to learn more about our musical archive, which is vast, our sound archive, which is vast. If you are interested in Jewish music, you should come and explore the riches of this institute, which will astonish you. And because of our new project to preserve and digitize all of YIVO's pre-war collections, not only here, but also in Vilnius, Lithuania, we are discovering new musical scores that have not seen the light of day in 70 years. These will shortly be made public through the process of digitization, and I hope that all of you who come this evening will have a chance to take advantage of the materials that are going to be put online, and that you will also consider becoming members of the YIVO Institute to help support the work of this institute, which has been in business now since 1925, and since 1925, while it has been in business, it has always been going out of business. And we are in somewhat better circumstances today, but we still need truly all of the support of all of you, and your showing up this evening is evidence of that. Information about membership can be found on the table outside. There will be people out there willing to assist you if you have any questions. And now I would like to invite Todd Palmer up to our stage to begin this evening's program. Thank you.
Good evening. Tonight, I'm very proud to introduce this group of musicians. Todd Palmer, the clarinetist, is a world-renowned soloist, chamber player, teacher, and he has premiered many new works by American composers. He has recorded the piece you're going to hear, The Dreams and Prayers of Isaac the Blind, by Osvaldo Golihov, under composer's supervision. And he also edited the parts for the quintet. And he's supported by the wonderful young musicians of the Yivo Kram Quartet. This group actually plays pretty regularly in our concerts, and we're very proud of them. They perform all over the world as soloists, as chamber players. They teach. Some of them are still in school, but they are the future and pride of American music. So you'll hear the Dreams and Prayers of Isaac the Blind. Tad will speak a little about it, and then you'll hear it again to get a new perspective on it. Hope you enjoy it.
say, or really know what to say about this work, other than I think it's the greatest work for this combination since the Brahms Clarinet Quintet. And it was written almost 100 years after the Brahms, and 100 years before the Brahms was the Mozart Clarinet Quintet, one of the most famous works in the chamber music genre. And certainly Mozart sort of set the bar very high when he wrote that work, and very few have attempted it with as great a success as Brahms and Golijov, I believe. Osvaldo is a very good... Can you hear me all? Is that okay? You hear me? Okay.
There's a hand mic over there.
Which one?
Either way.
Any of them? Okay. Is it on? Oh, okay, great. The story that I like to tell most often when working with this piece and with new musicians and with the audiences is when I first met Osvaldo. It was back in 1997, and I had gotten a call from one of the members of the St. Lawrence String Quartet, who are already good friends of mine, and they said, Todd, we want to play this great new work of Golijov. It's in the klezmer style. Can you do it? And I remember saying specifically, Barry, I don't know if I'm your man. I'm a Methodist. and what would I know about playing Jewish ethnic music such as this? But after hearing the work, they had sent me, I think, a live performance on a cassette tape, if you can believe it or not. There were still cassette tapes back then in 1997. And it was the great klezmer clarinetist Giora Feidman playing with the Cleveland Quartet. And I was so moved by this work. And the entire work takes 35 minutes to perform. We have just played for you the third movement of the piece. And I remember that evening in my apartment, the same apartment that you all rehearsed in with me, I listened to it 4 times in a row. So that, is over 2 hours worth of listening to the same piece. And I thought I would be a fool not to try and attempt it. And so what I did is that I studied, I went and bought recordings of great klezmer players and tried, and I always tell the audience, and I told Osvaldo, I just try and mimic the style the best I can for a goy such as me. So the thing is, it is a great piece of music. Now, this particular movement is called Kavakarat, and I'm sure a lot of you recognize the main melody, which is sung in the Rosh Hashanah services. And this work, rather this movement, predated the first 2 movements of the piece in its entirety, and he wrote it for a cantor and the Kronos String Quartet. So I imagine, although I've never heard that, I'm sure the cantor sings the various words in Hebrew that accompany this melody. And so this is kind of an instrumental reworking of that movement. And it grows to a big climax, and where the strings have this interlude before the very quiet postlude, which is on the bass clarinet, that was the other instrument I picked up, that is supposed to more or less represent the great conflict between man and God. And man has many questions to God, like, why is this, why is that? And in the end, they are unanswered. And that's why we don't really finish in, let's say, it doesn't really cadence properly. It's sort of like, there's sort of an ellipsis at the end of the music, if you will. So in any event, what's another great thing about this work is that it's kind of a piece of theater, because the clarinetist has 5 different instruments that you have to commandeer when you play the entire work. You need the B-flat clarinet that I was playing. You need the A clarinet, which is sort of the bigger brother to the B-flat. You need a bass clarinet. You need a little C clarinet, which has like a toy-like sound. And you need a basset horn. And a basset horn is something that Mozart was one of the first composers to write for, but then it sort of fell out of fashion. And I think there were only just a few instruments made back in the late 18th century, and then it just disappeared and no one else used it again until Mr. Golijov. And then I think when people got into more early performance practice and playing on original instruments and this and that, you would hear the Mozart Requiem played with basset horns. In any event, so the basset horn only plays in the postlude, and tonight I played it on the bass clarinet. because there are only 9 notes, and it's really not worth carrying an instrument all the way downtown here, just for 9 notes. But in any event, so I'd like to apologize that you didn't hear it in its most authentic version this evening. But I'm trying to think what else is really interesting about this work. Ozzy has stated that because it's in 3 movements, 3 large movements, the first 2 movements are both 12 minutes apiece, and it's about 10 minutes or so, that it represents 3 various languages of the Jewish people. The first is the most ancient Aramaic. The second, which is the big klezmer band movement, is Yiddish, and this is Hebrew. And Isaac the Blind was apparently a Kabbalist from 800 years ago or so, from Provence. And he said that all events and things that happened in the universe were combinations of letters from the Hebrew alphabet. And if you would like to study out more on that, please do, because you can inform me much more about Isaac the Blind. And who knows, he may not have been blind to begin with. But Ozzy, I asked him, I said, the title is so beautiful, the dreams and prayers of Isaac the Blind. I said, what does that really represent? And he said, I just liked how it sounded. But he's a poet at heart, so hence, a beautiful title to the work as well. I'm wondering if just what we played for you now, we're going to play it for you again. If you have any questions about what you heard or what we were doing, or the sound, sort of the soundscape that Osvaldo Golijov was using in the work, or if some of you are actually very familiar with the melody and and you probably were able to recognize that right away, and what were your experiences, If I could ask you questions, actually. Anyone? Do we have any cantors in the house? Yes. Oh. But, in the opening of the work, you may have heard the strings. What they do is that they're doing a number of various special effects on their instruments very quietly. And I wonder if maybe one of you, maybe Esther, if you could demonstrate what you do with the tremolos and with the sort of what he calls the spiccato and the various tempo indications with how you take the bow across the string and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, he doesn't use that much. It's sort of a little bit limited. He uses harmonics, tremolo, pretty much that's it, and spiccato, but we use that regularly. And he mixes those. And what is very interesting, though, is that there are not really measures, very, very often. So it's not measured. We really had to talk about it. We really had to come to a common agreement.
Right. It doesn't look like anything on the page, but to the musicians. But once they start rehearsing and we start playing, you figure out that certain things have to move at certain times, and it really is much more difficult than it looks on the page. Now the cellist, yeah, it looks like nothing, and the cellist really does well. Why don't you demonstrate what you do through 3/4 of the piece? She plays one note, but what's really interesting, she plays it on 2 different strings. And I think he calls it humming, doesn't he? Isn't that what it is? Yeah, humming like a prayer. That's what he has notated here for the cellist. And he uses a lot of other descriptive words throughout the entire work, like davening. I'm sure a lot of you know what davening is, like the sort of the motion when you're praying, and very descriptive things like chewing gum in broken glass. There's one. Now, how you apply that to music, who knows? But it's just imagery that he has that's really cool, and it just gives you sort of an idea of where his head is in the work, which has great expanse. It really does. A 35-minute work. And it rises to an amazing climax in the first movement where he has the bass clarinet up in the upper stratosphere of the instrument, which he does not require in the quiet postlude. And apparently, when he first called Giora Feidman to talk about this work, he asked Giora, how high can you play on the bass clarinet? And Giora said, kid, whatever you write, I can play. So he took that to heart, and he wrote these notes that are, well, if you know music, it is maybe like 15 ledger lines above the staff. So for the bass clarinet to really, It took me a while to find the right fingerings to get those notes each and every time, let me tell you that. But apparently when the Cleveland Quartet premiered it with Giora, they placed bets backstage to see like if he would get the notes or not. And even if he didn't get the notes, he would make something up. That was probably even better than the actual notes. But I do remember when I first heard it in New York at Alice Tully Hall. It might have been in, 1996 or 97, very shortly before I got the call from the St. Lawrence Quartet. And I went there, and I saw that I got there early because I didn't have a ticket. And I saw that there were like 5 different clarinets already set up on stage. And I thought, oh, they were having some sort of lecture demonstration on the clarinet and the clarinet family. But little did I know that the musicians would come out on stage and Giora would proceed to pick up each clarinet one by one throughout the piece. And I was thinking, who would ever want to play that piece? You know, you can't carry 5 clarinets around. One person cannot carry 5. Well, look, here I am. But I only have 2 tonight. In any event, but I just want to tell you that it's been such a rewarding experience for me to work with these wonderful musicians, and we just started last week. It's been amazing, the progress that we made from the very first 5 minutes of, you know, trying to figure out what this music is all about. And maybe someday we'll play the entire work. Who knows? It'd be a great pleasure with you all. In any event, I've now played this piece, well, over like 13, 14 years now with various groups, predominantly with the St. Lawrence String Quartet, and we've recorded it. And it was a very rewarding experience to actually delve into this kind of music that I would have never, ever had known about coming from Hagerstown, Maryland. That's all I can tell you. So, in any event, we'd like to play it for you one more time, and I'm sure you'll have an even better experience with it the second go-round.
We're going to have a short break. Don't go away. Maybe 7 or 8 minutes to continue our program.
Tonight we're going to hear a set of 6 scenes written by Paul Allen Levy. And I want to set the stage for those pieces. And before we do, tell you a little about the classical art song tradition. And then we'll get a chance to speak with Paul, and then we'll hear his songs with Maria Dominski. The classical art song tradition, in which a serious poetic text is set to music and the usual piano accompaniment reflecting and supporting the careful setting of the words as an integral component of the piece, began to emerge and then to flourish in the early 19th century. Some exponents of the art song, Schubert, Schumann, and Brahms in Germany, Debussy and Dupart in France, Russian songs by Rachmaninoff and Mussorgsky, and songs in other languages by Dvorak, Grieg, or Sibelius, 20th century English songs by Vaughan Williams and Benjamin Britten, and contemporaneous American songs by Charles Ives, Samuel Barber, and Ned Rorem are all examples that are well known. What is less well known is the secular Jewish counterpart of the art song, which formed an independent tradition of Yiddish art song and emerged at the last decades of the 19th century and began to bloom in the first decade of the 20th. This is an important and interesting story. As Yuval said, I'm president of the American Society for Jewish Music, which was founded in the United States in 1974. However, the Society's origins go back to 1908 in St. Petersburg. During the first decade of the 20th century, the Tsar briefly loosened the constraints on Jewish intellectual and cultural activity, among other things, and Jewish composers were allowed for the first time to form the Society for New Jewish Folk Music. In addition to forming this society, these composers proposed to explore the ethnic origins of Jewish music in Russia. Their goal was to use the collected material as the basis for new Jewish art music. In other words, contemporary art music. This interest in Jewish national music coincided with the nationalistic trends in music throughout Eastern Europe at the time. In Russia, composers led by Rimsky-Korsakov were composing new works based on Russian folk themes. In Hungary, Zoltán Kodály and later Béla Bartók undertook a massive recording project and cataloging of folk melodies and incorporated them into their compositions. Other composers, such as Antonín Dvořák and Leos Janáček, were increasingly seeking a uniquely national sound in their work. Parallel to this trend toward national music styles was an awakening of nationalistic sentiment among the Jews of Russia and Eastern Europe. Long subjected to severe restrictions on their lives, outbursts of violent anti-Semitic pogroms, and forced concentration in a segregated region of Russia called the Pale of Settlement, Russian Jewry developed an intense nationalistic identity from the 1880s onward. Ultimately, this resulted both in a number of political movements, as well as a flowering of Yiddish literature, a Yiddish theater movement, and publishing of Yiddish newspapers and periodicals. Among the members of the Society for Jewish Folk Music were composers Moses Milner, Yosef Akron, Alexander Krein, Yoel Engel, Mikhail Gnesin, Solomon Rozovsky, and Lazar Saminsky. These composers are sometimes referred to as the St. Petersburg School. Their published compositions, which forged a new path for Jewish music, are now digitized and available on the American Society for Jewish Music's website under the title The St. Petersburg Collection. Importantly, the next step was to take this folk material that they collected and used as the basis of their compositions to, for the first time, to take it to modern Yiddish and Hebrew poets as sources of entirely new compositions. And this was their next project, kind of collectively speaking. Over the next decades, for various reasons, but mostly because of adverse and changing political conditions, the Society for New Jewish Folk Music, under several different names, was centered first in Berlin, then in Israel, and eventually the United States, where the greatest exponent of Yiddish art song was Lazar Weiner, who lived from 1897 until 1982 and composed more than 100 Yiddish art songs. Unlike the earlier generation of Russian composers, Weiner's efforts to preserve the essential element of Yiddish culture that was in danger of disappearing forever was paramount. He returned to primarily Jewish sources, synagogue chants, Hasidic songs and dances, and biblical cantillation motifs, identifying among those sources the elements that had been least influenced by church music, opera, or commercial theater, which had powerful areas of influence in the Jewish community. As a result of the immigration and the growing prominence of Russian performers such as Jascha Heifetz, Nathan Milstein, Ephraim Zimbalist, Misha Elman, the famous violin students of Leopold Auer, who taught at the conservatory, the influence of these seminal Russian Jewish composers spread to Europe, Israel, and the United States, and the growth of the Yiddish art song spread as well. With this historical and contextual background, we flash forward 50 years or so from the 1930s, the prominence of these composers and these performers, and we talked to Paul Allen Levy, who has written a set of 6 Yiddish scenes based on traditional melodies. Paul? Paul, you're the winner of many honors and grants and awards, the recipient of many important performances, as the biography in the program says, and your works are recorded by several labels and published by a number of different publishers. You're also the beneficiary of prestigious commissions. You've written other music with Jewish content before, including a dramatic Passover oratorio called Dayenu. But I understand that the 6 Yiddish scenes is your first work in Yiddish. How did this all come about?
Well, this is an unusual story. The story dates back to 2002 when my wife Kathy and I went to New York from our home in Connecticut to hear a recital by the wonderful bass baritone Andre Solomon Glover, who had the kind of voice that could sing Old Man River and did in the production of Showboat that ran somewhat before that, but also performed with great sensitivity and nuance and communication in a single recital. We liked it so much that we asked him to do the recital again, or at least part of it, in at our temple in Norwalk, Connecticut, and he agreed under 2 conditions. One, that I would accompany him. But Andre, you've never heard me play a note. That's all right. You're a composer. I like your music. Composers accompany singers all the time. You'll manage. Okay. As it happened, I was a vocal accompanist. We both lucked out. And the other condition was that I arranged some Yiddish songs for him. Well, that was interesting. I did not expect to get a request from that quarter. So I started to do research. I went to Abraham Idelzen's collection of Eastern European Jewish music and went through, which is a huge collection, 1 volume out of 10, which itself has about 600 songs. And I went through them. And every now and then a song made me say, That's the best I can explain for how I chose them. But a couple of things were striking about the songs. One was that they were very short, and I didn't see how I would be able to expand them up to something as grand as a 2-minute arrangement, given what I had. And the other was that many of them used the same, of course, many of them were on the same topics and often with similar lyrics. So there are lots and lots of Mein Heart songs, my heart, and that's the first one you will hear is based on that. Lots of lullabies, most of them sung to Mein Vögele, my little bird. And so I decided to take, I wanted to end up with 6 songs, but I started out, I took 12 from Idelson's collection and mashed them together to make 6 scenes. And by scenes I meant I wanted each one to express the inner thoughts and feelings of a character or a situation, and actually having more than one song combined into a scene helped. And sometimes the solution for me was pretty simple, like taking 2 songs, the 2 Mein Heart songs that I chose, and having one be in the A and the other a B of an ABA form. Sometimes things were more complicated, like there were 2 lullabies where one lullaby gradually morphs into another, so it's really hard to tell which is which. And there were similar processes in the other songs. So I had finished 3 of the scenes when Andre had a stroke at 40 years old. And although he recovered, his short-term memory did not permit him to learn new music in a new language, in a new style, which it was much more devastating for him than it was for me, of course. So now I finished the cycle anyway, and now I had a song cycle and no performance. So to make it more marketable, I took his low voice version, I made a high voice version out of it, which you'll hear tonight. It's the same stuff. And I composed a version for chorus, also with piano accompaniment. And that's the first part of the story, yes.
I'm intrigued. Todd mentioned that the Galeoff piece was originally for cantor and instruments, and then it was reset in that way. How does your choral version, which I understand was conducted by Robert de Cormier, no less, differ from a great Yiddishist, by the way, Bob de Cormier? How does the choral version differ from the solo version?
Well, I kept the piano part, but in the songs for voice and piano, the piano deals with most of the harmony, a lot of the rhythm, a lot of extra color and mood, and I kept the piano part, but I also transferred most of those elements into the chorus. And the result, I think, is that when there are interesting harmonic progressions, you don't just hear an interesting progression, but you hear all the voices moving in interesting ways, so there's a real mass moving. It must be quite different. And I'm speaking in that tense because de Cormier called me shortly before he intended to perform it and told me that they were going to that they'd perform it in a church that was so small it had no piano, and would I please make an arrangement for guitar? So I did, and now the chorus had most of the sensuality and the color and the harmony, and the guitar played an important role. It was way up in Vermont, performed during a snowstorm. I didn't make it, and there was no recording. So I can't answer your question completely as how does it work, because I don't know.
Then we're hearing the premiere, I guess.
What?
Then we're hearing the premiere,
right?
Officially.
Right.
You're not a Yiddish speaker. How did you approach setting the text?
I do speak German, although I know that's not the same thing, but it at least helped me to understand the syntax. And I consulted with the Yiddish speakers. My friend and cousin Miriam Arsham helped a lot, and so did cantor Mary Feinsinger, who is now, I think she is billed as one of the greatest Yiddish scat singers alive. So she does, and edited music for among many other of her activities, edited music for Transcontinental Music Publishers, the Jewish music publisher. And so I got to know the words word by word, and at that point I could start to deal with them as though they were my native language, although I don't speak Yiddish.
Is there a particular thing you've learned about setting songs in Yiddish, or something that particularly attracts you as a composer?
Well, of course, I'm dealing with the melodies, and and the lyrics too. In my songs, if you happen to know the original melodies, you'll recognize them note for note. I haven't really changed them, or changed them hardly at all, except for the juxtapositions. But what I like is the minor scales, the minor scales with the augmented seconds appeal to me. The general sense of a combination of melancholy and comedy is very appealing to me. I do a lot of both, you might say. And I really feel pretty much at home in working with this stuff, but it sends my music in a different direction than it usually would have.
I spoke of composers who have collected folk songs and used them as the basis of their own compositions. Some illustrious examples, which I'm sure you have been aware of, as all musicians are. But what are some of the challenges of taking pre-existing folk melodies and setting them in a classical way? And is it easier to start from scratch? In other words, to set the text to your own self-composed melodies and accompaniment? Or is it easier working with pre-existing melodies?
Really, what's the difficult thing is the concept in the first place. I can write my own melodies, but I didn't just arrange these songs. I had a concept for each one, and that's what I would do if I were working with lyrics in any language. I try to figure out, what do I want to do with this? Why do I want to use these lyrics? And I'd find some kind of musical or emotional reason for doing that. So it doesn't feel any different to me. I still have to find a way to make these melodies my own, but in this case, keeping their own integrity.
If you're using these melodies, which are not of your own time and place, really, how do you remain true to your own individual style, the style of someone living in our time and working in our time and place?
Well, I'm not too concerned with maintaining my modernist chops, but still, I think of harmony and texture in a way that I'm sure was different from people at the time. For example, these wonderful scales that I mentioned, as far as I'm concerned, the harmony at any point can use any of the notes in those scales, regardless of what the simplest version would be. I can show you a couple of examples. So in this scale, for example, let's see if I can get this right. Would you do the honors? I need both hands. I can end up with things like this. So there's some nice spice available there, or even I like that. And I don't. Okay. Well, we can share. I like running into chords like that every now and then. However, this is. I think it's clear from hearing that this is the work of a 20th and 21st century composer, but without any of the fear that might engender in the listener by those by saying that.
Before we call Maria Dubinsky up, I guess I should ask a final question, and that is, if you had your choice, what would your next Yiddish commission be?
Make me an offer.
I'd like to invite Maria Dubinsky up to the stage, and let's hear these beautiful pieces.
We are going to finish our program with klezmer mixed with jazz. So when klezmers came to America, turn of the century, they were all played Polish klezmer music, which was influenced by Ukrainian, Romanian texture music, and at most synagogue music, the melodies, mostly synagogue music, a lot of folk music. When they came to the 1920s, the jazz became all rampant, and the klezmer music changed, got jazz elements in it. Clarinetist just David Taras, Naftali Brandwein were great klezmer players, used jazz, and then they had famous songs like Jackie Jazz 'Em Up, and by Mir Bist Du Schön, and the Freilach Swing, and it was all, jazzed up. Then the jazz the fashion kind of finished. And in the 1990s, it came back with a vengeance. And a lot of new groups played jazz and avant-garde, the Klezmatics, Giora Feitman, Frank London, David Krakauer, and John Zarn, him not far from Village, has a factory of klezmer jazz music, 800 recordings on his Tzadik label. So Paul Schoenfeld, whose music we'll hear, was commissioned to write cafe music by St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. Paul Schoenfeld is a very, very unusual composer. He writes symphonies and concertos and stuff, and all influenced by jazz or klezmer. And he worked in a bar as a cafe musician. And so this piece is really influenced by that. And in addition to being on the faculty of the University of Michigan, he's also a great student of Talmud and mathematics. That gives you an idea. Anyway, let's hear now one movement from the cafe music by Paul Schoenfeld.